Hello, everyone, and welcome to Life Story 999. Today, we bring you an emotional and uplifting story of resilience, love, and the unbreakable bonds of family. If you've ever felt forgotten or wondered how much you truly mean to your loved ones, this story will speak to your heart. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments or tell us your own story via email. Now, let's dive in. Frank Lawson, a widower in his late 70s, lived with his son Thomas and daughter-in-law Linda in their bustling suburban home. Frank had always prided himself on his independence, but after a bad fall left him with a fractured hip, life became a lot more difficult. Confined mostly to his room and relying on others, Frank began to feel like an outsider in the place he called home. Thomas and Linda were kind and caring, but their demanding jobs often left them with little time to spend with him. Frank couldn't help but feel that he was becoming more of a burden than a part of the family. One evening, while sitting alone in his room, Frank picked up a faded photograph of his late wife, Helen. He sighed deeply, the weight of his loneliness pressing down on him. He missed her warmth, her laughter, and the way she made every moment of their life together meaningful. The photograph was a reminder of all that had once been, of a life full of love, purpose, and partnership. Later that night, Frank gathered his courage and called Thomas into his room. His voice was steady, though tinged with sadness. "Take me to a nursing home," he said, his eyes downcast. "I don't want to be a burden to you and Linda anymore." Thomas hesitated, his heart aching as he looked at his father. He reached out, placing a reassuring hand on Frank's shoulder. "We'll talk about it soon, Dad," he replied, trying to sound optimistic. But even as he spoke, he knew his words were hollow. The days passed, and Frank's request faded into the background, swallowed up by the relentless pace of everyday life. Weeks went by, and the sense of loneliness that had gripped Frank only grew stronger. He watched as Thomas and Linda rushed about their lives, their smiles fleeting, their conversations with him often hurried and distracted. Frank tried not to let it hurt him, but it was hard not to feel invisible. He longed for the days when he was an active part of the family, when his voice mattered and his presence was cherished. One afternoon, as Frank sat by the window, watching the neighborhood children playing outside, he felt a pang of envy. Their laughter was carefree, their joy palpable. He wished he could feel that kind of happiness again, the kind that came from being surrounded by people who truly cared, who saw him for who he was and not as an obligation to be managed. The next evening, Frank found himself once again looking at Helen's photograph. He traced the edges of the frame with his fingers, his mind filled with memories of their life together. The picnics in the park, the long walks through their fields, the simple but profound moments that had made their life so beautiful. He whispered softly, "I wish you were here, Helen. You always knew how to make everything better." Have you ever felt forgotten or unseen by those you love? What would you do in Frank's shoes? Let us know in the comments below. Your stories matter, and we'd love to hear them. One Saturday morning, Thomas entered Frank's room with a smile. "Dad, pack your things. We're going on a trip," he said brightly. Linda stood beside him, holding a crisp shirt and Frank's favorite hat. Frank's heart sank. He feared this was it. Thomas was finally taking him to a nursing home. He reluctantly packed his bag, folding each item with care. He took one last look around his room, his eyes lingering on the framed photograph of Helen on his nightstand, before following Thomas and Linda out to the car. The air felt heavy as Frank settled into the back seat, his heart filled with uncertainty. He glanced at Thomas and Linda, trying to read their expressions, but they gave nothing away. The car pulled out of the driveway, and Frank stared out the window, his thoughts a mix of worry and resignation. As they drove, the lively city streets soon gave way to open countryside. The rolling hills and fields reminded Frank of simpler times. He remembered when he and Helen worked their own small piece of land, finding joy in each other's company as they nurtured the earth and watched their hard work come to life. His heart ached for those days filled with purpose and the comforting presence of his beloved wife. The silence in the car was broken only by the hum of the engine. Frank watched as the cityscape disappeared, replaced by the greens and golds of the countryside. His unease deepened with each passing mile, his mind filled with questions. He wanted to ask Thomas where they were going, but a part of him feared the answer. He swallowed hard, finally mustering the courage to speak. "Where are we going?" Frank asked, his voice barely a whisper. Thomas glanced at him in the rearview mirror, a mysterious smile playing on his lips. "You'll see," he replied, his tone light but giving nothing away. Linda turned slightly in her seat, offering Frank a reassuring smile. "Just trust us, Frank. We think you'll like it." Frank tried to smile back, but his heart remained heavy. He turned his attention back to the window, watching as they passed fields dotted with grazing cattle and farmhouses nestled among the trees. The scenery was beautiful, but it did little to calm his nerves. He couldn't shake the feeling that this trip was the beginning of the end of his independence, the end of his place in the family. After about an hour, the car turned onto a gravel path lined with towering oak trees. The road was secluded, winding through dense woods that seemed to stretch on forever. Frank's unease grew as the car crunched along the gravel, the sound echoing in the quiet of the countryside. He clenched his hands in his lap, his heart pounding in his chest. Then, suddenly, the trees gave way to a clearing, and Frank gasped. There, standing tall and proud, was his old farmhouse. The white paint gleamed in the sunlight, the porch railings looked freshly painted, and the swing he had built for Helen so many years ago hung from the old oak tree in the front yard. It was just as he remembered it before the fire had taken it all away. "Welcome home, Dad," Thomas said softly, turning to look at Frank as he brought the car to a stop. Frank's eyes widened, his breath catching in his throat. "How?" he managed to say, his voice trembling. Thomas stepped out of the car and hurried to Frank's side, opening the door and helping him out. Frank's legs felt weak as he stood, his eyes fixed on the farmhouse. He could hardly believe what he was seeing. The house, the yard, everything looked exactly as it had before. Tears filled his eyes as he took a shaky step forward, his hand gripping Thomas's arm for support. "We wanted to bring you back to the place you love," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. "We knew how much this place meant to you, Dad, so we rebuilt it." Linda came to Frank's other side, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. "We never planned to take you to a nursing home, Frank," she said softly. "We wanted to give you back your home, a place where you could feel happy again." Frank looked at them both, his eyes filled with tears. He felt overwhelmed, his heart swelling with a mix of disbelief, gratitude, and love. You did this for me?" he asked, his voice breaking. Thomas nodded, his own eyes glistening. "You've always been there for us, Dad. Now it's our turn to be here for you." Frank took another step toward the house, his gaze sweeping over the porch, the windows, the familiar details that had once made this place his home. He could almost see Helen standing on the porch, her smile bright and welcoming. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the memories wash over him, feeling the warmth of the love that had built this home, the love that had rebuilt it once again. "Welcome home," Linda whispered, her voice full of emotion. Frank opened his eyes, a smile breaking across his face as tears spilled down his cheeks. "I'm home," he said softly, his heart filled with a joy he hadn't felt in years. Frank's heart pounded as he took in the sight of the farmhouse. It was perfect. The white paint gleamed in the sunlight. The porch railings looked freshly painted, and there, hanging from the old oak tree, was the swing he had built for Helen so many years ago. Tears welled up in his eyes. How did you do this?" Frank stammered, his voice choked with emotion. "We never planned to send you to a nursing home, Dad," Linda said, her voice gentle. "We knew how much this place meant to you, so we rebuilt it." Thomas led Frank inside, where every corner of the house had been lovingly restored. On the mantel above the fireplace sat a photograph of Frank and Helen on their wedding day. Frank's favorite armchair, reupholstered in the same fabric Helen had chosen years ago, sat by the window, inviting him to sit and stay. "We used the money from the land sale," Thomas explained, "and the neighbors pitched in too. Everyone wanted to help bring this place back for you." Frank's legs felt weak, and he sank into his armchair. He looked around the room, overwhelmed by the love and care that had gone into every detail. The walls were painted in warm, familiar colors, and the shelves were filled with trinkets and keepsakes that held so many memories. It was as if the years had melted away, and he was stepping back into the life he had once known. "You've given me back more than just a house," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "You've given me back my purpose, my family, and my memories." Thomas knelt beside his father, his hand resting on Frank's arm. "You've always been there for us, Dad," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This was the least we could do for you. We wanted you to have a place where you could be happy, where you could feel at home again." Linda smiled, her eyes glistening with tears. "You're not a burden, Frank. You're our family. We wanted to make sure you knew just how much you mean to us." Frank looked at them both, his heart swelling with gratitude. He had felt so alone, so unwanted, but now, sitting here in his restored home, he realized how deeply he was loved. He wasn't a burden. He was the foundation of this family, the roots that held them all together. "I don't know how to thank you," Frank said, his voice breaking. "This is more than I ever could have hoped for." Thomas stood, pulling his father into a gentle hug. "You don't need to thank us, Dad. Just being here, seeing you happy, is all we need." Frank held onto his son, his eyes closed as he let the love of his family wash over him. The years of loneliness, the feeling of being a burden, it all seemed to fade away in that moment. He had a home again, not just in the physical sense, but in the love and warmth that surrounded him. Linda walked over to the kitchen, where the aroma of freshly baked bread wafted through the air. "We even made your favorite, Dad," she called out with a smile. "Just like Helen used to make." Frank smiled, his heart swelling with emotion. He slowly stood, leaning on Thomas for support as they made their way to the kitchen. He looked around, taking in the familiar details: the wooden table where they had shared countless meals, the curtains Helen had sewn, the plates that had been passed down through generations. "It's perfect," Frank said, his voice full of awe. He sat down at the table, the warmth of the kitchen enveloping him. He felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years, a sense of belonging. As Linda placed a warm loaf of bread on the table, Frank reached for her hand. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for giving me my life back." Linda smiled, squeezing his hand gently. "We love you, Frank, and we're just so glad to have you here, right where you belong." Frank looked around the room, his eyes filled with tears. He knew that this was where he was meant to be, surrounded by the love of his family, in the home that had been rebuilt not just with wood and nails, but with care, devotion, and the desire to make him feel whole again. It wasn't just a house. It was a symbol of love, of family, and of the memories they had shared and would continue to make together. And for Frank, that was everything. He was home. Just as Frank thought the surprises were over, he heard a familiar sound, a soft whinny. He turned toward the barn and saw Daisy, his beloved horse, standing there, her mane shining in the sunlight. "She made it," Frank gasped, his voice breaking as he rushed over to embrace her. "She wandered into town after the fire," Thomas said, smiling. "We've been caring for her until we could bring her home." Frank buried his face in Daisy's mane, feeling the warmth of her presence. For the first time in years, he felt complete. The connection to his past, the memories of working the fields with Helen by his side, came flooding back. He stroked Daisy's neck, his tears soaking into her coat as he whispered softly, "I missed you, girl." Thomas and Linda watched from a few steps away, their own eyes glistening with tears. It was a moment they had hoped for, a moment that made all their efforts worthwhile. To see Frank reunited not only with his home, but also with the beloved companion who had been a part of his happiest memories was more than they could have imagined. Frank finally pulled away from Daisy, turning to face his family. His eyes were filled with gratitude and love. "Thank you," he said, his voice trembling. "You've given me back everything I thought I'd lost." Thomas stepped forward, placing a hand on his father's shoulder. "You've always been our rock, Dad," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's time we took care of you. You deserve this, to be happy, to have everything you love." Linda nodded, stepping closer and wrapping her arms around both Thomas and Frank. "You're not alone, Frank," she said softly. "We're here, and we're going to make sure that every day from now on is filled with love and joy." Frank looked at his family, his heart swelling with emotion. He had spent so long feeling like a burden, like someone who had lost his place in the world. But now, standing here with Thomas, Linda, and Daisy, he realized that his place had never been lost. It had always been right here, in the hearts of the people who loved him. "You two have given me a gift I can never repay," Frank said, his voice cracking. This means everything to me." Thomas smiled, shaking his head. "You don't need to repay us, Dad. Just having you here, seeing you happy is all we need." Frank nodded, his eyes misting over once again. He turned back to Daisy, giving her one more gentle pat before they all began to walk back toward the farmhouse. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the fields, and the warmth of the day lingered in the air. They walked slowly, taking in the beauty of the farm that had been brought back to life. Frank held Thomas's arm for support, his heart light and his spirit lifted. As they reached the porch, Frank paused, looking back at the barn, the fields, and Daisy grazing contentedly nearby. He felt an overwhelming sense of peace, a peace that had been missing for so long. "This is home," Frank said quietly, his voice filled with emotion. "Not just the house, but everything, the land, the memories, the love. It's all here." Linda smiled, her eyes meeting Frank's. "And we're all here together. That's what makes it home." Frank took a deep breath, the scent of the earth and the fading warmth of the sun filling him with a sense of belonging. He knew now that he was where he was meant to be, surrounded by the love of his family, the memories of his past, and the promise of new moments yet to come. It was an emotional reunion, one that brought together every piece of his heart that had felt lost. And as they stepped inside, the warmth of the house embracing them, Frank knew that he was finally, truly, home. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Frank sat on the porch with Thomas and Linda. The distant sound of crickets filled the air, and Daisy grazed peacefully in the field. The golden glow of the sunset bathed the farmhouse, wrapping them in warmth and peace. "You were never a burden, Dad," Thomas said, breaking the comfortable silence. "You're our foundation. You made us who we are." Frank reached for his son's hand, feeling a deep sense of belonging. "I see that now," he replied, his voice steady. "I thought I had lost everything, but I was wrong. You've shown me that love endures, that family is everything." Linda smiled, her eyes glistening. "This is your home, Frank. It always has been, and it always will be." As they sat there, the sky turning dark and the first stars beginning to twinkle, Frank knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. He wasn't just a memory in a forgotten room. He was home, surrounded by the love of his family. "To new beginnings," Frank said softly, his voice filled with hope. "To new beginnings," Thomas and Linda echoed, their voices carrying the promise of a brighter tomorrow. And in that moment, as the stars shone above and the warmth of his family surrounded him, Frank felt his heart swell with peace and joy. He was home, and that was all that mattered. Thank you for watching this heartwarming story of love, resilience, and family. Frank's journey shows us that no one is ever truly a burden when love is unconditional. What would you do to show someone how much they mean to you? Share your thoughts in the comments below, or send us your stories via email. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Life Story 999 for more uplifting stories. Until next time, may your days be filled with love and connection.